Lucas Harlow had walked the frozen Montana backcountry 100 times, but nothing prepared him for the night he found the cabin. Years earlier, a battlefield explosion had stolen his canine partner Bruno, leaving only silence and grief. Yet now, on a deserted trail beneath the black pine ridges of Snow Creek, Lucas pushed open a warped cabin door and froze. Inside lay Rex, the German shepherd once partnered with a young officer who died mysteriously a year ago, scarred, bleeding, and trembling from a gunshot wound. The cabin smelled of iron and secrets. This wasn't just survival. It was a warning. What happened next will break your heart and make you believe in second chances again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Snow fell in thick curtains over Snow Creek, Montana, cloaking the mountains and pine ridges in silence. The storm had arrived early that evening, swallowing the valley in a white shroud, and the roads were already impassable except for those who knew every bend and drift. Lucas Harlow trudged through it with his collar pulled high, boots sinking deep into the drifts, his breath rising like smoke against the frozen air. At 46, Lucas carried his years heavily, though not in the slump of his shoulders, but in the softness that wrapped around him like armor. His face was sharply cut, the jaw square and dusted with stubble that had turned more gray than black. His eyes a hard steel blue that had once scanned deserts for threats, but now only searched the tree lines for comfort. His dark hair, trimmed short out of habit, bore a streak of silver at the temples. He had the bearing of a man who had been built by discipline and fractured by loss. Loss was what had driven him here, to the solitude of his family's old farmhouse on the outskirts of Snow Creek. Years earlier, in the searing heat of Iraq, Lucas had served as a handler for Bruno, a German shepherd trained to detect explosives. Bruno had been loyal, fearless, with sable and black fur and amber eyes that seemed to read Lucas's soul. They had been inseparable, until the day an improvised explosive device had detonated on a roadside patrol. Lucas had survived, scarred and deafened in one ear, but Bruno had died in the blast, saving the squad with his final charge. The memory had never loosened its grip on him. Nights brought the smell of sand and cordite back, and the echo of Paws he would never hear again. Now, trudging through snow, he felt the same emptiness yawning in his chest, a wound the cold only deepened. He had told himself the walk was routine, just checking the fence lines of his property as the storm grew worse. But in truth, he was restless. Winter nights often forced him out into the elements, as though he could outrun the ghosts that stalked him indoors. The forest at the edge of his land rose tall, black trunks stabbing through the snow like grave markers. It was here, among the ancient pines, that Lucas saw something unusual. Faint tracks cutting through the powder, too fresh to be his own. His steel blue eyes narrowed. The prints were deep, shaped by heavy boots, and alongside them ran another set, paw prints, large and precise, a German shepherd's. Lucas's chest tightened. He knew the pattern by heart, the way the toes splayed, the claws marked clean. It was impossible, yet undeniable. He followed them, each step weighted with disbelief, until the trees parted and a cabin came into view. The cabin leaned like an old man caught in mid-collapse, its wooden frame warped, the chimney cracked, the shutters banging loosely in the wind. Snow had buried it up to the windows, but smoke did not rise from the chimney, nor light spill from the windows. It looked abandoned, but the tracks led straight to its door. Lucas felt the sting of memory. Years earlier, he and Bruno had once taken shelter in this very place during a blizzard. To see it again now, under the same storm, was like being pulled back through time. He pushed the warped door, shoulder braced against the frozen wood, until it groaned open. The smell hit him immediately, iron, rot, and something sharp, like dried blood. His flashlight cut across broken furniture, a rusted stove, and a wall lined with peeling wallpaper. The silence was suffocating. He took one step, the floorboards groaning under his boots. That was when he heard it, a faint whimper. Lucas froze, heart hammering. Slowly, he swung the light toward the sound. In the corner, beneath a collapsed crate and half buried in old blankets, a shape stirred. At first it seemed only a bundle of fur coats tossed aside, but then it shifted, revealing the outline of a dog. The beam caught its face. A German shepherd, fur darkened by blood and dirt, body trembling with each shallow breath. Its amber eyes cracked open, locking on him with a mixture of fear and recognition. A gunshot wound marred its shoulder, the fur matted stiff with crimson. Lucas's knees buckled, not from weakness, but from shock. He whispered, "Bruno." The name slipped out unbidden, like a prayer. But even as he said it, he knew it was not his Bruno. The muzzle was longer, the ears sharper, the coat younger though battered. Around its neck hung a worn leather collar, the metal tag scratched but still legible. Lucas wiped the grime away with a trembling, gloved hand. The name etched there was not Bruno. It was Rex. Memory rushed in. Rex had belonged to Officer Mark Dwyer, a young policeman from Snow Creek who had volunteered for K-9 service overseas. Mark had been tall, lean, with sandy hair and a smile that made people trust him. He was respected for his patience and warmth, the kind of man who spoke gently to strangers and trusted easily. Yet a year ago, Mark had died in what had been called a botched ambush outside of town. Circumstances clouded in silence. Rex had vanished the same night, many assuming he had died with his handler. Lucas stared down at the wounded shepherd, realization hardening in his chest. Rex had survived, wandering alone for a year, carrying the shadows of whatever had killed Mark. And now he lay here, bleeding in a forgotten cabin, as though fate had dragged him into Lucas's path. The dog whined again, trying weakly to lift his head. Lucas knelt, tearing strips from his coat to press against the wound. "Easy, boy. I've got you." His voice was steady, but inside his heart twisted. It was Bruno's ghost he saw in Rex's amber eyes, and for a moment the line between past and present blurred until his vision stung. He worked quickly, instincts from his battlefield days taking over. His hands were sure, wrapping cloth tight to slow the bleeding. Rex shuddered under his touch, but did not resist. As though recognizing in Lucas something familiar, the same loneliness, the same scars. Snow howled outside, rattling the cabin's walls, but inside a fragile bond had been struck. Lucas whispered as he secured the makeshift bandage, "You're not Bruno, but maybe you're here for a reason." When he lifted the dog into his arms, Rex's weight dragged on his weary muscles, but Lucas bore it without flinching. The shepherd's fur was cold against his chest, yet the faint rhythm of his breathing warmed something in Lucas that had long been frozen. He stepped back into the storm, the cabin door groaning shut behind him, leaving its secrets buried in dust and shadows. As he trudged toward home, snow swirling around them, Lucas felt something he had not in years: purpose. Rex's survival was no accident. The prints in the snow, the wound from a military round, the ghost of Mark Dwyer's death, it all pointed to something festering in the mountains. And Lucas knew the storm in Snow Creek was only beginning. By the time Lucas reached the faint glow of his farmhouse windows, Rex still breathing weakly in his arms, he understood this much. Ghosts returned not to haunt, but to warn, and Snow Creek was hiding truths no blizzard could bury. The storm had softened to a whisper by the time Lucas Harlow carried Rex across the last stretch of field. The farmhouse stood dim against the swirling snow, its windows glowing faintly with the warmth of embers left alive in the hearth. Lucas's breath hung in ragged clouds, his arms trembling from both exhaustion and the weight of the injured German shepherd. He paused once, leaning against the fence post at the edge of his land, and forced himself to focus. The dog was still breathing, though shallow, and each rise of its chest felt like a fragile promise. Before stepping inside, Lucas cast one more glance behind him, back toward the forest's black wall of pines. The snow there was marked with tracks, boot prints heavy and deliberate, overlapping with paw prints that matched Rex's stride. He had studied them quickly before leaving the cabin. The boots were large, belonging to a man of some weight, the tread deep enough to suggest military or tactical footwear. Whoever had left them had not come alone. The dog prints followed close, parallel, like a partner walking at his side. Rex had not wandered here by chance. He had been brought. Inside the farmhouse, Lucas laid Rex on an old quilt near the hearth. The dog whimpered softly, his amber eyes half open, tracking Lucas with a flicker of wary recognition. The bandage Lucas had wrapped in the cabin was soaked through, crimson spreading into the cloth. Lucas crouched, his steel-blue eyes narrowing as he peeled back the makeshift dressing, cleaning it with water warmed over the fire. The wound was deep, clean, the mark of a bullet meant to wound but not instantly kill. His stomach tightened. Whoever had shot Rex wanted to slow him, not finish him quickly. That implied intent, control. Lucas's hands worked with battlefield efficiency, pressing fresh gauze and tightening it with strips torn from an old undershirt. He remembered countless nights in Iraq crouched over wounded soldiers, the air filled with grit and gunpowder, trying to buy minutes until the medevac arrived. Here there was no medevac, no squad, only him, the storm, and a dog carrying someone else's unfinished story. By dawn, Rex had slipped into uneasy sleep. Lucas, too restless to rest, pulled on his coat again and trudged toward town. The snow had thinned into pale drifts along the main road, the air sharp and brittle. Snow Creek was a small place, one main street with a grocery, a diner, and a post office whose windows still bore faded Christmas decorations. The people here knew each other by name, or at least by story. Lucas, though born here, had become more rumor than neighbor. They whispered of his solitude, his scars, his haunted walks through the woods. He rarely gave them reason to think otherwise. At the diner he stepped inside, the bell above the door jangling faintly. The smell of coffee and bacon clung to the air, steaming against frost-covered windows. Behind the counter stood Sarah Coleman, a woman in her 30s, late 30s, tall and thin, with chestnut hair tied back loosely, and a pale, freckled face that bore both kindness and fatigue. Her hazel eyes were sharp, though, the kind that caught details most people missed. She had run the diner since her husband left years ago, raising 2 boys while keeping the town fed. Life had hardened her, but not bitterly. Instead, she carried herself with quiet determination. "Lucas," she said with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "He almost never came in. Storm didn't keep you in?" "Needed supplies," he replied shortly, sliding onto a stool. His voice was rough, the product of too many nights speaking only to himself. Sarah poured him coffee, watching him carefully. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Lucas hesitated. He didn't share easily, but something in her steady presence broke past his instinct for silence. "I found a dog," he said at last. "Not just any." Rex. The name silenced the diner. A trucker at the back booth lifted his head, brows rising. A pair of older women stopped stirring sugar into their tea. Sarah set down the pot slowly. "Rex? Mark Dwyer's Rex?" Lucas nodded. Sarah leaned closer, her voice low. "People said that dog died the night Mark did, vanished into the storm. How is he alive?" "He's hurt," Lucas said. "Shot. Found him in an old cabin." Sarah's lips pressed thin, her eyes darting away. Mark's death never sat right with me. They said it was an ambush out by the ridge, but nobody explained why he was out there alone that night, or why there were gunshots before backup ever arrived. She shook her head, bitterness flashing across her pale features. That dog. If he's still alive, maybe he knows more than we ever got told. A voice interrupted from the corner. Or maybe he just wandered into the wrong company. The speaker was Henry Weller, a retired logger in his 60s, broad-shouldered even with age. His face seamed with scars from both blades and life. His beard was thick and white, his eyes pale blue but clouded with cataracts. He had the manner of a man who once commanded attention with volume and fists, now softened only slightly by age. He sipped his coffee with a grunt. Mark was good people. But good people cross the wrong men, and you don't get answers, you just get silence. Lucas studied Henry, weighing the bitterness in his tone. There was knowledge there, something unspoken, but pushing would only close him off. He turned back to Sarah. I'll need more bandages. Dog food, if you've got it. And coffee. Sarah nodded, though her hazel eyes lingered on him. Lucas, if Rex survived, maybe Mark's death wasn't just an accident. Maybe you're walking into something bigger. Lucas met her gaze steadily. I know. When he left the diner, the supplies packed into his coat, the sun was breaking weakly through the storm's remnants. The town carried on as usual, but Lucas felt the shift. The name Rex had unsettled them, stirring old questions that had never been answered. As he trudged back toward his farm, he felt Rex's amber eyes in his memory, that mix of pain and warning. The prints in the snow, the bullet wound, the cabin. It all tied back to Mark Dwyer's death. At the farmhouse, Rex stirred when Lucas stepped inside, lifting his head weakly, ears pricking at the familiar sound of boots. Lucas knelt beside him, running a steady hand over the dog's scarred fur. You didn't just survive. You came back for a reason. By the end of that day, Lucas understood one thing. Rex had not simply returned from the shadows. He had brought them with him. And the truth about Mark Dwyer's death was buried somewhere in the mountains that loomed beyond Snow Creek. The farmhouse was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the steady, shallow breaths of Rex as he lay stretched out on the old quilt. The storm outside had lessened to a low hiss across the fields, but inside, Lucas Harlow still felt the weight of battle pressing on him. His steel blue eyes, bloodshot from exhaustion, remained fixed on the German shepherd, even as dawn crept through the frosted window panes. Rex stirred weakly, shifting his head as if trying to settle more comfortably. When Lucas leaned closer to check the bandage, his fingers brushed something hard hidden beneath the matted fur. At first he thought it was debris, a shard of metal lodged from the bullet's graze. But as he gently parted the fur, he saw the edge of a chain. Pulling carefully, he uncovered a tarnished silver pendant, dulled by time and grime. It was a military dog tag. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. The tag was dented, the engraved letters worn but still legible under the firelight. M. Dwyer, U.S. Army K-9 Division. His hand trembled as he turned it over, seeing the faint etching of a unit insignia, nearly rubbed smooth. He remembered Mark Dwyer, the young officer with sandy hair, and the kind of easy smile that disarmed even the most bitter townsfolk. Mark had been younger than Lucas by nearly 15 years, a man of hope and belief in institutions that Lucas himself had lost. The fact that Rex had carried this tag tucked deep in his fur, hidden like a secret, gnawed at Lucas's mind. Someone had placed it there. Someone had wanted the dog to be found. Rex whined softly, his amber eyes opening to meet Lucas's. There was something unspoken in that gaze. Pain, loyalty, but also urgency. Lucas pressed a hand against the shepherd's chest, steadying him, You saw something, didn't you? You were there when Mark died. For a moment, it was as if Rex understood. His ears twitched, his eyes locked on Lucas's face, and then he let out a low rumble in his throat, almost like an answer. Lucas felt a chill ripple down his spine. Later that morning, Lucas carried the tag into town, tucked in his pocket, his mind restless with questions. At the diner, Sarah Coleman noticed the tightness in his jaw and the shadows under his eyes. Her hazel gaze was sharp as she slid a plate of eggs toward him. You look like a man who hasn't slept. Lucas placed the tag on the counter. The silver clink echoed through the room. Sarah froze. "That's Mark's," she whispered, fingers trembling as she reached for it, but stopped just short. "It was hidden in Rex's fur," Lucas said. "He's alive, hurt, but alive. And he carried this." Sarah's lips parted, her freckles stark against her pale cheeks as the color drained from them. "Mark never took that tag off," she murmured. "Not once." "If Rex has it," she trailed off, shaking her head, "it means he was with him until the end." A voice behind them spoke, gravelly and low. Henry Weller had shuffled in, his bulk wrapped in a patched coat, his cane thumping against the floorboards. His pale eyes narrowed on the tag. If that dog still had it, then Mark didn't just fall into an ambush. Somebody made sure that story stayed buried. Lucas studied Henry. The man's bitterness was palpable, but now it felt less like cynicism and more like knowledge earned the hard way. Henry lowered himself heavily into a booth, his beard brushing against his collar. Mark was poking around where he shouldn't have. "I told him once, too many strange trucks moving through the ridge at night, too many crates hauled up the old logging trails. He didn't listen, said it was his duty. Good men die when they trust too much." Sarah shot Henry a look, her hazel eyes sharp. "And you just kept quiet." Henry's pale eyes flicked to her, then back to Lucas. "I kept breathing. That's all survival is in these parts." Lucas pocketed the tag again, his jaw clenched. He felt the old ache in his chest, the echo of Bruno's last stand overseas. Now another dog had survived what his handler had not, and it was as if fate had placed the burden in Lucas's hands. He stood abruptly, leaving bills on the counter. "Thanks for breakfast," Sarah called after him, her voice unsteady. "Lucas, be careful. Snow Creek's not the quiet town it looks like, and if Rex found his way back, maybe someone wanted him gone for a reason." That night, Lucas sat on the porch, the snow still falling but lighter now, flakes catching in his unshaven beard. Rex lay at his feet, his breathing steadier, though every shift of his body betrayed the wound's pain. Lucas turned the tag over in his fingers, staring at the letters until they blurred. "You're not just a survivor," Lucas murmured to the dog. "You're a witness." Rex raised his head slightly, ears twitching at Lucas's voice, and let out a low whimper. Lucas felt it deep in his bones. The dog carried not just memories, but proof. Something Mark had uncovered, something dangerous enough that it had cost him his life. And now the same danger lingered in the mountains, waiting. By the end of that night, Lucas knew Rex was no ordinary companion. He was the last thread in a web of silence around Mark Dwyer's death. And silence, Lucas had learned, always hid the worst truths. The morning after finding Mark Dwyer's dog tag, Lucas Harlow woke with the heavy certainty that he couldn't keep Rex alive on battlefield bandages alone. The shepherd's wound had stopped bleeding heavily, but infection lingered in the heat beneath the skin, and every movement brought a sharp whimper from the dog's throat. Lucas had fought to keep men alive in desert heat and choking dust, but he had never done it alone and never without proper tools. He needed help. The road into town was half buried in snow, but Lucas loaded Rex gently into the back of his pickup, lining the bed with blankets and covering him against the cold. As he drove toward Snow Creek, the mountains pressed close on either side, black ridges rising above pale white fields. Each mile felt like the slow pull of memory, dragging him back into conflicts he had tried to bury. Bruno's death in Iraq, the way the explosion had ripped silence across the desert, was never far from him. Now, as Rex whimpered softly behind him, the echo of that night replayed in every heartbeat. Snow Creek's veterinary clinic was a modest red brick building on the edge of town, its roofline sagging under snow. Inside, the warmth smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay, a reminder that the doctor treated farm animals as often as house pets. Behind the counter, Clara Ross emerged, pulling on a pair of surgical gloves. Clara was in her early 40s, tall and willowy, with light brown hair streaked prematurely with silver. Her face was pale but graceful, framed by tired green eyes that seemed to carry both compassion and iron resolve. Years of treating broken horses and frost-bitten cattle had given her a calm, precise air. Nothing startled her, though plenty had scarred her. Lucas carried Rex in, cradling the shepherd's weight against his chest. Clara's eyes widened slightly at the sight, but her voice was steady. "Put him on the table." Carefully, Lucas laid Rex down, his jaw tight. He was shot. Shoulder, left side. "I stopped the bleeding, but it's deep." Clara peeled back the bandage, her brows knitting. "You weren't wrong. This isn't a hunting wound." She leaned closer, her gloved fingers tracing around the edges. "Entry's clean." Whoever fired was trained to place a disabling shot, not a kill. I'll need to go in. The procedure was delicate, Clara working under bright lights with steady hands. Lucas stood beside the table, every nerve taut, listening to the metallic click of instruments and the dog's shallow breathing. When she finally placed the extracted bullet on a tray, Lucas's eyes fixed on it. Clara's voice cut into his thoughts. "That's no hunting round. This is a 9mm full metal jacket. Military issue. Law enforcement too, but not something locals carry for sport." Lucas clenched his fists. So whoever shot him knew what they were doing. Clara nodded grimly, and wanted him to live just long enough to suffer from the waiting. "Area," a rough voice intruded, "or long enough to deliver a message." Lucas turned sharply. Caleb Roark stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane. Caleb was in his late 60s, a once burly man, now worn thin by time and old wounds. His beard was salt and pepper, trimmed close against a square jaw, and his gray eyes carried the restless watchfulness of a soldier who never stopped scanning horizons. He had served as a ranger decades earlier, but everyone in town knew he had come home with shrapnel in his hip and ghosts in his head. Caleb's walk was uneven, but his voice remained hard, steady as a rifle barrel. Lucas knew him by reputation, a man who had taught half the county how to shoot straight, but lived mostly in silence since his discharge. Caleb stepped closer, peering at the bullet on Clara's tray. His scarred hand tapped the metal. "That round's not lying. Whoever's firing these is armed like my old platoon. And trust me, no good comes from that being in a logging town." Clara glanced at him warily. "You've seen this before?" Caleb nodded once, the movement stiff. "Back when the Army cracked down on smuggling rings overseas. They'd steal crates of ammunition, sell them through black channels, sometimes to militias, sometimes to criminals. If you're finding this here—" His eyes narrowed, flicking toward Lucas. Then Snow Creek sitting on something bigger than poachers. Lucas's steel blue eyes met his, and Mark Dwyer was caught in the middle of it. Silence filled the clinic. Clara adjusted Rex's bandage and said softly, "Whatever killed Mark, it wasn't just bad luck." Lucas reached out, running his hand down Rex's scarred fur. The shepherd's amber eyes opened briefly, searching for reassurance, then drifted closed again. Lucas felt the weight of responsibility deepen. He had buried one dog in Iraq. He would not bury another here. As Caleb turned to leave, he paused, cane tapping against the floor. "Watch yourself, Harlow." Men who trade in military rounds don't forgive witnesses. That dog isn't just a survivor. He's evidence. That night, back at the farmhouse, Lucas sat near the hearth with Rex resting against his leg, the firelight flickering across his lined face, the tag in his pocket burned against his chest, the bullet's memory sharper than steel. He thought of Mark Dwyer, the optimism in his young face, cut down before 30. He thought of Bruno, swallowed by fire and sand. And now, Rex, wounded but alive, pressing his head into Lucas's knee as if to remind him that loyalty didn't die with a handler. Lucas whispered into the quiet, "You came back to warn me, didn't you? To drag me back into a fight I thought I'd left behind." The dog's ear twitched, and for a moment it felt like confirmation. By the end of that night, Lucas understood the truth. Rex had not returned to be saved. He had returned to save Lucas, and to uncover the shadow of were now buried in the heart of Snow Creek. Snow Creek slept beneath a gray veil as Lucas Harlow pulled his coat tighter against the wind. Caleb Rourke trudged beside him, cane sinking into the snow with each careful step. The two men walked in silence until the outline of the cabin emerged from the trees, its warped walls leaning under the weight of ice. The place looked even older in the pale daylight, less a shelter than a tomb that had been waiting for discovery. Lucas paused at the threshold, steel blue eyes sweeping the ground. The tracks he had seen before were now softened by snowfall, but signs remained, the faint press of boot soles, the scuff of heavy crates dragged across the frost. His chest tightened. "They were here," he muttered. Caleb grunted, his gray eyes narrowed under heavy brows. "Let's see what they left behind." Inside, the cabin smelled stronger now, like rust and chemicals. The hearth was dead cold, but along the far wall several plastic barrels were stacked haphazardly, some labeled with faint hazard symbols. Lucas crouched, wiping away snow and grime from one, a faded red diamond, corrosive material. The barrel's rim was cracked, leaking a pungent stench into the air. Nearby lay scattered shell casings, 9mm, identical to the bullet Clara had extracted from Rex. Lucas's jaw tightened. This isn't poaching. It's military-grade supply. Caleb leaned on his cane, lips pressed thin. Chemicals like this don't belong in hunting cabins. They're for manufacturing, or worse, transporting without oversight. Someone's running operations out here, and they're armed enough to protect it. Lucas scanned the room again, flashlight glinting off something near a broken crate. He picked up a scrap of fabric, stiff with dried blood. His stomach turned. It wasn't Rex's. Caleb's voice cut into his thoughts, low and rough. Men like these don't leave bodies lying around. They erase them. The two followed the faint trail leading deeper into the forest. The snow muffled their steps, but Rex, despite his limp, pushed forward with quiet urgency. His black and tan coat bristled, his amber eyes locked ahead. Every so often he stopped to sniff the air, hackles rising, as though the ground itself whispered secrets only he could hear. The path narrowed through thick spruce until the forest opened to a rocky ridge. There, half hidden by drifts, yawned a cave mouth dark as an open wound. The scent of oil and ammonia lingered, carried on the wind. Lucas raised a hand to halt Caleb, crouching low. Rex crept forward, his body tense, a low growl vibrating in his throat. From within the cave came muffled voices, men speaking in clipped tones. Lucas edged closer, peering around the jagged stone. The dim light of lanterns revealed 3 men hauling black duffel bags toward the mouth of the cave. Their faces were shadowed, but their movements precise, practiced, like soldiers executing routine drills. One man stepped into the lantern glow, his features Sharp and unmistakable. Wade McCullen. Lucas's stomach dropped. He knew the name, the reputation, a ranger who had once led units through impossible terrain, a man feared and respected in equal measure. But McCullen had been discharged dishonorably after accusations of brutality and smuggling overseas. The Army had washed its hands of him. Some said he disappeared into mercenary work, others that he was dead. Yet here he stood, alive, directing men like a commander once more. McCullen's presence radiated authority even in the ragged cold. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, his black beard streaked with iron gray. His face was weathered, hard lines cut deep around a mouth that rarely smiled. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned every corner like a predator, ensuring no weakness went unnoticed. The scars on his knuckles and the way he carried himself spoke of violence made routine, cruelty honed into instinct. Lucas felt Rex stiffen beside him, the dog's growl deepening. The shepherd's ears were pinned back, his gaze locked on McCullen with something close to recognition. Lucas's breath hitched. "You know him, don't you?" he whispered. The dog's response was a sharp bark stifled in his throat, the sound of rage barely contained. Caleb leaned closer, voice a rasp. "If McCullen's here, it explains everything. Men like him don't just move chemicals for money. They build networks, smuggling, weapons. Whatever killed Mark Dwyer, it leads back to him." Inside the cave, McCullen barked orders. "Keep the crates dry. We move again at dawn. No mistakes." His voice carried the weight of command, and the other men obeyed instantly. Lucas pulled back, pressing his back to the stone wall. His mind raced. Mark had died in an ambush near these ridges. Rex had vanished the same night, carrying his master's dog tag like a final message. And now, staring into the mouth of the cave, Lucas saw the answer written in cold faces and contraband barrels. Mark hadn't stumbled into an accident. He had crossed Wade McCullen's path. Rex shifted closer, resting his head against Lucas's knee, eyes blazing. The dog didn't need words to confirm the truth. His growl was enough. By the time they turned back toward town, Lucas knew the battle wasn't behind him. It was waiting in the mountain shadows, commanded by Wade McCullen. And Rex had returned not just to survive, but to point the way toward the men who killed his first master. The storm rose again with a fury that rattled the mountains like a drum. Snow whipped sideways across the ridge, stinging Lucas Harlow's face as he crouched behind a boulder overlooking the cave. Beside him, Caleb Rourke steadied his cane against the rock. His gray eyes narrowed through the flurries. Rex pressed low to the ground, his dark coat blending into the shadows, amber eyes glowing with anticipation. Lucas's camera, a small military-issue model he had never quite let go of, hummed quietly in his gloved hands. Through the lens, he captured every movement inside the cave. Men hauling crates, barrels rolled toward the shadows, weapons slung casually as if violence were second nature. Most damning of all, Wade McCullen barking orders like a commander, directing his platoon. Caleb muttered under his breath, voice low and hoarse, "That's enough evidence to bring in the feds." His hand trembled slightly on the cane, though not from the cold. Lucas knew Caleb's body carried shrapnel and age like shackles, but his mind was still sharp, still haunted by the wars he'd fought. Inside the cave, McCullen's voice cut through the storm. "Dom, set the charges. We move out in 20. From the shadows stepped Dom Vargas, a tall, scarred man in his late 30s. His build was wiry but lethal, the kind of strength that came from years of close-quarters combat. A ragged buzz cut revealed a scalp lined with faint burns, and his face bore a long scar from temple to jaw, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. Dom's eyes were cold, predator's eyes, focused only on the task. He had once been Special Forces, Lucas recalled, until rumors of brutality and corruption had seen him discharged. Men like Dom didn't vanish. They simply found darker employers. Vargas knelt near the cave's entrance, pulling a bundle of explosives from his pack. His movements were practiced, almost casual, as he set a timer and began wiring the charges. Lucas's stomach dropped. They weren't just moving the contraband. They planned to erase every trace. Caleb's whisper cut sharp. "We can't wait. Once that detonator starts, the whole ridge goes with it." Lucas exhaled, frost clouding in the air. He felt Rex tense beside him, the dog's gaze locked on Vargas. The shepherd's muscles quivered with barely restrained instinct, a low growl building in his throat. Lucas pressed a hand against Rex's side. "Not yet," he whispered, though his own pulse screamed for action. Then Vargas flicked the switch. The timer began its slow, relentless countdown. Rex lunged. The shepherd burst from the shadows like a cannonball, teeth bared, fur bristling. He hit Vargas hard, jaws clamping around the man's wrist before he could finish arming the charge. Vargas roared, the detonator slipping from his grip as blood splattered the snow. His free hand swung wildly, trying to pry the dog off, but Rex held fast, snarling with a ferocity that defied his wounded side. Lucas surged forward, boots pounding through snow. He dove for the detonator, ripping the wires free before the device could finish arming. His fingers moved with the muscle memory of a dozen bomb disposals in Iraq, his breath ragged with urgency. The timer went dark. McCullen's voice thundered from the cave. "What the hell?" He stormed forward, his broad frame filling the entrance, rage carved across his scarred face. Caleb, steady despite the storm, raised a revolver with both hands. His knuckles were white, his gray eyes locked down the sights. "Drop it, McCullen!" he barked, his voice carrying the authority of battles past. For a moment, time froze. McCullen glaring into the storm, Caleb holding the line with a weapon that shook in his aged grip, Lucas crouched over the disarmed bomb, and Rex still locked on Vargas's arm, refusing to let go. But chaos had its own script. From the shadows of the cave, a younger smuggler panicked. Barely more than 20, his beard thin and patchy, eyes wide with fear, he bolted into the snow, clutching nothing but terror. His boots slipped on the ice as he fled, vanishing into the storm. McCullen cursed, his voice thick with fury. "Cowards!" He raised his rifle, but Caleb's revolver didn't waver. "Try it," Caleb growled. Lucas shoved the detonator deep into his pocket and pulled Rex back, prying the dog's teeth from Vargas's arm. Blood soaked through the man's sleeve as he crumpled in pain, spitting curses. Lucas shoved him face first into the snow, pinning him down. Vargas's eyes burned with hate, even as crimson seeped between his fingers. McCullen stood at the cave's edge, his chest heaving. His calculating eyes swept over Lucas, Caleb, and Rex, the fury slowly giving way to a cold, measured smirk. "You think this ends here?" he snarled. "You've bought yourselves time, nothing more." "I'll be back, and when I come, you'll wish you'd left this mountain buried." The storm swallowed his words as he retreated into the shadows of the cave, vanishing with the men still loyal enough to follow. Lucas exhaled, snow clinging to his beard, his heart hammering. Caleb lowered the revolver slowly, his hands trembling now that the moment had passed. Rex leaned against Lucas's leg, panting, his muzzle streaked with Vargas's blood, but his eyes steady, unbroken. By the end of that night, the charges were disarmed, Vargas lay captured, and McCullen's operation was shaken. The blizzard raged around them, but Lucas knew the real storm had only begun. McCullen would return, and the war he brought to Snow Creek was far from finished. The storm broke at last. By the time the gray light of morning touched the ridges of Snow Creek, the cave was silent, except for the wind moaning through its stone throat. Lucas Harlow stood near the entrance, his breath curling in the frigid air. Rex pressed close against his leg. Caleb leaned heavily on his cane a few feet away, his face pale, his body trembling with fatigue, but his gray eyes sharp with grim satisfaction. They had survived the night, but survival was only the first step. Evidence now weighed heavy in Lucas's pack. The disarmed detonator, photographs of crates stamped with military codes, and the battered form of Dom Vargas, bound and bleeding, lying unconscious in the snow where Rex had left his mark. By mid-morning, the rumble of engines echoed through the valley. Black SUVs rolled into the clearing, their tires crunching over frozen earth. Men and women in heavy tactical gear spilled out, their movements precise, weapons slung at the ready. At their head was Daniel Mercer, the federal agent dispatched to take command. Mercer was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame still disciplined from years of service. His short-cropped hair was streaked with early gray, his jaw square, clean-shaven, and his eyes a piercing steel gray that missed nothing. Dressed in a heavy black coat over his tactical vest, he carried himself with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Yet beneath the stern exterior there was a flicker of empathy, the kind that came from too many nights staring at the aftermath of violence. He shook Lucas's hand firmly, his grip strong. "You Harlow?" "Army vet, right? We've read the reports." His gaze slid to Rex, whose amber eyes watched warily from Lucas's side. "And that must be the dog." The one who survived, Lucas nodded once. Rex. He belonged to Mark Dwyer. At the name, Mercer's jaw tightened. "Dwyer's file crossed my desk last year. We knew his death was messy, but without proof, it was buried. You've given us what we needed." He glanced toward Vargas, who groaned faintly in the snow. "And a witness who'll talk, one way or another." Caleb shifted his weight, his cane sinking into the snow. "Don't underestimate McCullen," he rasped. "He's still out there. And men like him don't go quietly." Mercer's steel-gray eyes hardened. "We'll find him." His networks cracked wide open now. He'll run, but he'll bleed contacts with every mile. For the rest of the day, the clearing buzzed with controlled chaos. Agents hauled out crates from the cave, their hazard labels glinting under the weak sun. Black duffels were opened to reveal weapons, stacks of cash, and chemical canisters that made even the most hardened officers pause. Evidence bags filled, photographs were taken, and Vargas was strapped into a reinforced vehicle, his face twisted with pain and fury. Lucas stood apart, watching, his breath rising steady but heavy. The adrenaline of the night had drained, leaving the ache of old wounds in his chest. He felt Caleb's hand rest briefly on his shoulder, the old ranger's scarred fingers gripping with surprising strength. "You did what needed doing," Caleb said quietly. "Don't forget that." That evening, as the sun dipped and the first stars blinked through thinning clouds, the town of Snow Creek gathered. It wasn't a grand ceremony, just townsfolk drawn by whispers, clustered in the square where lanterns glowed warmly against the snow. Sarah Coleman stood at the front, her chestnut hair pulled back, her hazel eyes shining with pride as she carried a folded flag. Children peered from behind their parents, their breath puffing in the cold. Even Henry Weller, grizzled and weary, stood with his hat in his hands, his pale eyes wet with memory. At the center of the crowd stood Lucas and Rex. The shepherd's shoulder was wrapped neatly in Clara Ross's bandages, his gait still stiff, but his head held high. The scar across his side caught the lantern glow, not as a mark of weakness, but as a badge of survival. Lucas rested a steady hand on his fur, his steel blue eyes scanning the faces before him. Mercer stepped forward, his voice carrying clear. "Today, we honor not just the uncovering of a crime, but the resilience of those who stood against it. Lucas Harlow, who carried the burden of war back home and chose to fight again when no one else could. And Rex, once the partner of Officer Mark Dwyer, now the living testament that loyalty survives even death. For his courage, Rex is hereby named Honorary K9 of Gallatin County. A cheer rippled through the crowd, muted but heartfelt. Sarah pressed the folded flag into Lucas's hands, her hazel eyes shimmering. "Mark would be proud," she whispered. Lucas swallowed hard, his throat tight. He knelt beside Rex, pulling a polished collar from his pocket. The brass tag gleamed in the lantern light, freshly engraved. Rex, Honorary K9, Gallatin County. With steady hands, Lucas clipped it around the shepherd's neck. Rex leaned into him, pressing his head against Lucas's chest, amber eyes softening with something that felt like trust renewed. Lucas whispered, his voice breaking, "I thought I'd lost everything. But you're the part of my heart God left behind." The crowd stood silent, the moment stretching like the first breath of dawn. And then, slowly, voices rose in quiet applause, the sound echoing off the snowbound buildings. Clara Ross smiled faintly from the crowd. Caleb stood straighter despite his limp, and even Henry wiped a rough hand across his weathered cheek. Above them the sky blushed pink with the first light of a new day. The storm had passed, leaving Snow Creek washed clean beneath the fragile brilliance of morning. On the snowy street, the shadow of a man and a scarred dog stretched long and steady, a symbol etched against the earth. By the time the sun rose fully, Lucas, Harlow, and Rex were no longer just survivors of separate wars. They were partners bound by loss and rebirth, standing as proof that even in the coldest places, loyalty and faith could bring dawn back again. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, trumpets, or bright lights. Sometimes they limp through the snow on four scarred legs, carrying memories of loyalty and love that death could not erase. For Lucas, Rex was not just a dog. He was God's reminder that even in our darkest winters, there is still a dawn waiting to rise. And maybe that's true for us, too. In everyday life, when storms of loneliness, grief, or fear feel endless, sometimes God sends us small miracles, an unexpected friend, a word of kindness, a sign of hope we didn't believe could return. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still walk among us. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we keep telling stories of faith, resilience, and love. May God bless you, your family, and every soul who walks beside you.